Okay, hello. This is the second and final tape where much of what I'm going to talk about is terminology, and this is just important fundamental information to have going into the course. As you'll see, what we have up here is causality and threats to internal validity. These are terms that if you want to impress all of your friends and sound brilliant, erudite, and as my 13-year-old son likes to call it, scientifical, you can sound very much more scientifical after this conversation. The most relevant application of this information in terms of the different projects and assignments that you're learning to do in this class will come when we talk about the single subject design, or the AB or ABA. The purpose of the ABA design is to try to assert causality in working with just one person. As I believe I said in the introductory lecture, one of the big challenges in working with people one at a time and trying to assert something like clinical intervention brought about change is that with any one person it is almost impossible, if change happens, to know what caused the change. And that's a real challenge not only with single subjects, but in our profession and in life in general. We very often can see that something is happening, but at the same time, what's leading to it? If we think about national or global issues, the idea of global warming comes to mind as a global question of this. Most people agree that the Earth is heating up, and except for a few people, that tends to be fairly well accepted, and science will show that, we have gone up this many degrees centigrade on average, and at the poles it's more. So that's not really what people are arguing about. What people are arguing about is how come this is happening. If we accept that it's happening, what is leading to it? And where the contention comes in is it caused by humans, or is it just a natural cycle? And then there's well, how much is caused by humans? And then, of course, there's and what does it all mean? Those are places that certainly we're not going to go with this lecture. But the idea of, okay, we know that the globe is getting warmer, but is it because of what we're doing? Is it because of the methane and the carbon dioxide that we're putting into the atmosphere? Is it somehow human caused, or at least contributed to, or not? What is the causal agent? Any of the tools that we're working on in this class will help you to measure, better or worse, more sort of microscopically or more macroscopically, is my client changing? Or does my program help people to change? Or, are people in my program changing? What the harder question is my client changing because of our work together? Or are the people in our program becoming more healthy because they're participating in the program? So it's not just are people changing. If I give students a test at the end of the quarter in this class, and you get 95s and 100s, I can say, wow, you guys really know this stuff very well. But what I'd really like to think to, sort of please my narcissistic ego as a teacher is not only do you know this stuff really well, but you know the stuff really well because you came to class, you paid attention, and the class helped you gain that knowledge. Now, if you came to class with that knowledge, you would have got the same score 10 weeks prior to the end of class. It would have nothing to do with me, the teacher, nothing to do with you, the student in this class, nothing to do with the textbook, everything to do with you already knew it. If you came to class and class was useless, but you said, I need this knowledge, so while I'm taking the class at the same time, I need to figure out from the internet, from friends, from other schools, how to learn about clinical evaluation, and so you were much more knowledgeable 10 weeks later, but it had nothing to do with this class. Then again, we're measuring change, but we're attributing cause perhaps to this class, but it's not really because of this class. So if we're looking at, is my client changing? Maybe my client is changing, but is he or she changing because of our clinical work together? This is a huge issue in medicine, and one of the big reasons that there's a controversy and concern about overuse of antibiotics. Many, many times people, and more so before it came to attention, but many times people would feel poorly, you know. Oh, I've got a sore throat, and I'm coughing, and I think I have a fever. So you go to the health clinic, or you go to your doctor, and the doctor says, well, yeah, you know, you might have a virus, and you might have a bacterial infection, and here, let me pull out my prescription pad and write you, you know, a prescription for penicillin, or amoxicillin, or tetracycline, or something like that. They give you the prescription, you go to the pharmacy, you fill the prescription, you start taking your amoxicillin, and lo and behold, your fever goes away, your sore throat goes away, and you do great. Now, most people say, hey, that pill really helped me. So the next time they get the sore throat and feel sort of feverish and ucky, they go back to the doctor and say, can I have some more amoxicillin? It worked really well last time. Well, you were sick, and you took amoxicillin and you got better. Does that mean the amoxicillin made you better? Well, maybe it did. But maybe you got sick, you stayed sick for a few days before you dragged yourself home, go to the doctors, I'll pay the money, I'll wait in the waiting room for 3 hours. You go, by then your body was starting to heal, and you started taking amoxicillin, and if you'd never taken a pill in your life, 2 or 3 days later, you'd feel great because your body was fighting off the virus. But your body's fighting off the virus, and you take an antibiotic which doesn't touch a virus, and you get better, and you thank the amoxicillin, which means you then want amoxicillin every time you feel poorly. It really doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the amoxicillin. It has to do with the fact your body was getting better. But sometimes you really have a bacterial infection, and if you don't take amoxicillin, you're not going to get better because your body has a harder time fighting off that infection. How do we know? Well, part of the purpose of this class and of the purpose of science is not only figuring out, okay, people are changing, why are people changing? You know, people do wonderful things, people do silly things, people do stupid things. What causes that? If we can understand the cause of things, it really helps us, we believe, it helps us to prevent bad things from happening, and it helps us to encourage good things to happen if we know what that's due to. So again, in the purpose of this class, which is to measure the impact of your clinical intervention, causality is, if people are changing and for the better, is it because of our intervention? So let's talk about some of the troubles that we have in asserting causality in especially social sciences, but we'll also just go over some basic science concepts. So for causality, there are sort of described as 3 sort of necessary and sufficient conditions. Necessary meaning you got to have them, and sufficient meaning if you have them, it's complete. You can say that you have this thing. So these are sort of the necessary and sufficient conditions that many sort of scientists, expert writers say are important to have for causality. The first is a time or order effect. If we're going to say A causes B, I want to say that the amoxicillin causes me to become healthy. It wouldn't make any sense to make that assertion if I got healthy before I took the amoxicillin. Why would I ever attribute change to a pill if the pill wasn't even in my body? So the cause needs to precede the effect. If A is the amoxicillin and B is the feel better, A needs to precede B. If the cause happens after the effect, it seems silly that that would actually be causal. One of the examples I have in your handout, which is a far probably more memorable, if disgusting example, is if I want to study whether riding on a very twisty, spinny ride causes people to upchuck, then we have to ride the twisty, spinny ride first and only upchuck when we are on or after we get off the ride in order to meet this criteria. Second criteria, correlation. Many of you have probably heard correlation does not equal causality. If you haven't heard it yet, you are getting your opportunity to hear it now, and if you have heard it, you're getting to hear it again. Correlation does not equal causality. It is one component of, but it alone does not mean something is causal. But if something is causal, it must be correlated. What a correlation means is simply that as something changes, there is a predictable change in the something else. As A changes, there is a predictable change in B. Now we call it a positive correlation if they change in the same direction. If as A goes up, B goes up. Or if as A goes down, B goes down. Those are positively correlated. They move together, up, down, up, down, up, down. You can also have a correlation where A goes up and B goes down. That's an inverse correlation, but it still can be a very strong correlation. Those of you who took stat classes who are familiar with the Pearson R is equal to, if an R is equal to 0, this means that there is no correlation. An R of either a negative 1.0 or a positive 1.0 is a perfect correlation. Every time A happens, B happens. And there's no time that A occurs that B doesn't occur. They go in perfect sync with one another. This just means one's going up, one's going down, and this means they go up or down together. You must have correlation as a part of asserting causality. As one changes, it influences, it affects the other. The third is this rule out plausible alternatives. What that means is, and we can't explain the change by anything else plausible. So A precedes B. As A changes, B changes predictably. And nothing else really could explain this any better than A could. So to go with the correlation of amoxicillin and the being sick, there is a correlation such that, generally speaking, if people are sick and they take amoxicillin, they get better. So the more you take amoxicillin, the more you get more healthy. As amoxicillin use goes up, getting healthy goes up. You could also say if people don't take amoxicillin, they stay sick. As amoxicillin use goes down, health goes down. The two tend to move together. That would be a positive correlation between amoxicillin use and illness. If we talk about our amusement park example, as the ride gets spinnier, or as people ride spinnier rides, they upchuck more. And if any of you have been to amusement parks, there's an amusement park I went to often as a kid, and they had this very twisty, spinny octopus, and as soon as they, let people off the ride, there was somebody standing out there with the hose, time after time after time. And I don't think they ever ran that ride without somebody losing, a hot dog or a pizza or something like that. So as riding spinny rides goes up, upchucking goes up. As riding spinny rides goes down, upchucking goes down. That would be a correlation. Rule out plausible alternatives. Is there something else that might explain how the change? So what else could lead to people getting healthier? Well, sometimes time alone leads to people getting healthier. I'm sick, and I take amoxicillin, and my body fights off the virus all by itself while the amoxicillin was in my system. Maybe it was just time. Maybe I'm sick, and so I don't go to work, and I sleep in the morning, and I get a lot more rest than usual, and I drink a lot of fluids, and I eat very healthy foods, and I take my vitamin C and my echinacea, and all of that stuff, and I'm healthier. And maybe it had to do with healthy life changes, and the amoxicillin was just sort of along for the ride. If I happen to go to an amusement park, and I happen to have the flu, it might be that I didn't need to ride the octopus or any other spinny ride. It might simply be that I was sick and at the amusement park and I rode a spinny ride, and even if I hadn't ridden the spinny ride, I still would have upchucked. So those are some plausible alternatives that we could rule out. Now, in a perfect world, in order to have something be causal, A would always precede B. We would have a perfect correlation such that every time there was a change in A, there would be an equal unit change in B. And nothing else would explain the data nearly as well. And sometimes in a physical world, this kind of sort of works. If we think about things like dropping eggs onto hard floors makes them break, we drop the egg before it breaks. Pretty much every time we drop a typical egg, it's going to smash. And there aren't a lot of plausible alternatives as to what else causes that egg to smash other than hitting the hard floor. If we say water helps plants to grow, well, if you water the plant first and then it grows, every plant that gets watered grows, and pretty much most plants that don't get water croak pretty quickly. And there might be some plausible alternatives, such as the plant needs nutrition, but without water, most plants don't live for very long. So in the physical world, this stuff applies fairly well. In the social world, though, it gets more difficult. If I want to talk about treatment, going to therapy must precede getting better. That would be my time and order effect. Well, many times people do get better after they go to therapy. But any of you who have read on the solution focus brief therapy model know that oftentimes if you measure between when people pick up the telephone and call and set up an appointment and when they show up for their first session, a whole bunch of positive change happens. How can that be if therapy is causing change? Maybe it's the anticipation of therapy which causes change. People who may be standing in front of a spinny ride in an amusement park may just look at the octopus and go, oh, and start feeling queasy, and they've never gotten on it. The anticipation of the ride makes them nauseous. So the nausea happens perhaps before they actually get on. So sometimes time and order in social sciences is hard to tease out. Correlation. If you look at correlation values in almost any social science field, you will never see a positive one or a negative one. You'll sometimes see correlations of like, a negative 0.72 or a positive 0.83 or something, but it is rare to get, it is almost impossible to get a perfect correlation. Every change in A leads to a predictable exact change in B. We get these sometimes kind of things. Sometimes I'm sick and I take amoxicillin and I get better. Sometimes I'm sick and I don't take amoxicillin and I get better. Sometimes I'm sick, I take amoxicillin and I don't get better. And sometimes I'm sick and I don't take amoxicillin and I don't get better. It's not a perfect one-to-one correlation. Some people go to therapy and they feel a lot better. Some people go to therapy and they don't. Some people go to therapy and they get worse. So we don't get this beautiful perfectness. Rule out plausible alternatives. I go to therapy and I feel better. Was it the therapy or was it anything else going on in my life? As we know, many times if people, start seeing a counselor, if people, are doing anything with a social worker, there's a gazillion other things. Most people who go to a mental health clinic, they get referred to a case manager who helps them make a whole bunch of lifestyle changes. They start taking, GED classes, and they have someone help them, take care of their house better. They go to counseling. They go see a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist may put them on an antidepressant, an anti-anxiety, a mood stabilizer, any of a whole host of drugs. The client gets better. Well, how do we rule out the plausible alternatives? Was it the meds? Was it the counseling? Was it, the life changes that the case manager helped to bring about? Was it that the client was simply ready to change, and all of this is superfluous? All that matters is the client was ready to change, and he or she would have done it on their own. So ruling out plausible alternatives is very, very, very hard to do in our profession. It doesn't mean that we can't say, it's likely that A causes B. But it sure makes it a lot harder to say, I prove that A causes B, which is why, as a scientist, especially in social sciences, the word prove simply gets slashed and burned. We say we have evidence for it. We have documentation. This suggests, but we really don't use the term prove because meeting these criteria perfectly is just about, if not completely, impossible. Now, to rule out plausible alternatives, there are a bunch of alternatives which tend to be more plausible than others, or at least there are categories of plausible alternatives. People say all of, and if you've heard the term confounding variables, or confounds. What a confounding variable is some other variable that could explain your outcome. Some variable other than what it is that you're specifically looking for that might actually have led to the change that you saw. A good researcher pays attention to what are possible confounds, and in a perfect world, you rule out or control for as many of those as is humanly possible. It's impossible to rule them all out. It's impossible to be aware of all of them. But you do the best that you can, and you're aware of them, and you kind of detail in your discussion section the ones that you couldn't account for as possible other plausible alternatives, possible other ways to explain what it is that you found. So what threats to internal validity are, this list I have are sort of titles or names given to common classes of confounding variables. And so we will go over what they are, a little bit of how to fix them, and some examples. If we talk about threats to internal validity, the first thing you have to know is what in the heck is internal validity? So if in the previous tape or CD or podcast of terms, I talked about test validity, test reliability, and I promised you that I would talk about internal and external validity. Here is your opportunity. Internal validity. A study has more internal validity or less internal validity. It doesn't have it or it doesn't. It has more of it or less of it. And what it is the cleanness of the study or the ability of the study to rule out other causes of the change that brought about. So a study with really high internal validity has very little room left for confounding variables. It's pretty darn clear that A caused B and nothing else caused B. So lots of internal validity, very clear picture. It really was the intervention that led to the outcome. Low internal validity, gosh, it could be A that caused B, but it could be any of a zillion other things too. There's a lot of slop. Now the problem is that in real world research, there is a lot of slop. The world is a sloppy, messy place. Humans are terribly complex, and our environment and the lives we lead are incredibly diverse. So to isolate any one thing is nigh impossible. This is part of why psychologists do what are called analog studies, or medical research is instead of studying humans, and the other reason is ethics. But in addition to ethics, why people will put lab rats into a cage is because you can isolate what is the effect of smoking on the body of an animal. Well, if you have an animal or a person in the free environment, he or she may not be smoking, but certainly up until 10 years ago, you might live with a smoker, you might go out to restaurants and sit next to smokers. Many public places, 10 and more years ago, exposed people to lots of secondhand smoke. You get on an airplane, you breathe other people's smoke. You ride a city bus or a Greyhound bus, you breathe other people's smoke. And other things can cause smoking-related diseases, such as other pollutants in the air, such as genetics and so forth. So how do we know that it's cigarettes and that it's you're smoking those cigarettes and not a zillion other things that might lead to, say, lung cancer? So we get rats, and we put these rats in this cage and those rats in this cage, and they've all been bred from the same stock. They've cloned. They're all the exact same rat 20 years from now or 10 years from now. But you put these exactly the same rats in two cages, and the only difference, there's no difference in diet, there's no difference in activities, there's no difference in the TV shows that those rats watch, there's no difference in the clothes those rats wear. They're in their two separate cages with the same toys and the same everything, except these get smoke pumped in and these don't. Lots of internal validity. If the smoking rats get lung cancer at a higher rate than the non-smoky rats, we have a very nice clean, it was the smoke because there's no other difference. But how do we do this with humans who live in the real world, which is so varied and complex? So we do it better or worse, and the better we do it, we call it more internal validity. The worse we do it, we call it less internal validity. The problem with a lot of internal validity is it has very little what we call external validity. External validity is real worldliness. It's how how much does this mirror reality? Well, most rats do not come from the exact same cloned genetic stock. They were produced by a bunch of rats who were living, in the sewer or the dumpsters of some city or out in the fields. So we have very false situation there. We have this perfectly, pristine environment except for the smoke. That is not real life. So oftentimes, a study which has a lot of internal validity doesn't have a lot of real worldliness. The features are so artificially constructed in order to get this purity that we lose its relevance to the rest of life. With humans, it's hard to get really good internal validity. We can try, but it doesn't generalize. It doesn't generalize to sort of real general people or real general rats or mice who live very different lives. So it's kind of a balance, and it's what's more important. And so what we often do is we start with these very pure, pristine studies, and if we can show that exactly the same rats raised in 2 separate cages with the only difference being these have smoke pumped in, that causes lung cancer, then can we start watering it down, lower this a little bit, raise this, and still see the impact. And that's how much of science is done. Anyway, to these sort of categories of threats to internal validity. These are things that get in the way. These are things that steal our fire. They're things that we say, oh, I think my intervention led to my outcome. And it really wasn't your intervention. It really was something else. First one of these is history. And there's a handout on D2L, so feel free to look at that to get these in your head as best as possible. The history effect, or the history threat to internal validity, has to do with something which is outside of the person and is outside the study and has an influence on the outcome. So one of the most powerful history effects that I have seen in the recent past is New York City, September 11th, 2001. Let's say you are a researcher or you are a clinician and you are studying the effect of your treatment on anxiety levels of clients in your clinic. So people are going along and their stress levels are, kind of in your study, coming down, coming down, coming down, coming down. And this is the beginning of August, and you finish your study in October. And so it sort of looks like things are going well. And then suddenly you get the post-test scores, and they're way the heck up here. And you say, well, what happened? It looks like our treatment, if all you have is, let's say, a pre-test score. Pre-test, people are here on stress. Post-test, people are here on stress. This makes it look like my intervention actually caused people to be more stressed rather than less stressed. Well, if you know that in here was 9, 11, 01, we suddenly have a whole different explanation for why people's stress scores went up. And it's not that my treatment necessarily was toxic. It's that a huge, enormous national stressor, which happened right in New York City, so if I'm doing this study in New York, happened and everybody's stress level went way up. So a history effect it's outside the person, it's outside the study, and it can lead to an outcome which can be misinterpreted as actually having been brought about by the intervention. Another thing is if you're working with clients, let's say here in the Pacific Northwest, and you're studying depression levels, and you start your research in January, and you get a Hamilton or a Beck or a Burns score pretest, and you run a 10-week treatment group, which ends in March. And you find out at the end of March that everybody's much, much, much happier than they were when they started. And you say, cool, my treatment group works. Well, it could be that your treatment group works, but it could also be that in the middle of January in this part of the world, the weather is foggy and it's cold and it's drippy and people kind of feel like this. And by March, the sun is out and the trees are blooming and the flowers are out and people are feeling much better. It may have nothing to do with your intervention and everything to do with the weather change. So how do you know if it was your intervention or if it was the change in weather? How do you know if stress scores got worse because your treatment was actually stress-producing rather than stress-reducing, or if this is just a picture of the impact of 9/11? The answer to that is control group is a really good thing, and we'll come to that in just a minute. Maturation is very similar to history, except that while history is something that happens outside of the study and outside of the person, maturation happens outside of the study, but it happens inside of the person. In a longitudinal study, this can actually be physical maturation. So my favorite story for this one is someone develops this wonderful group to help verbal skills in very young children. And a few years ago, how could we help our child's developing brain? And, preschools were playing Mozart round the clock and so forth, and people were reading to babies in their tummies and all this stuff because this was going to give you, the next Albert Einstein child. So let's say that you capitalize on this and you open up a program that says, I will teach your 6-month-old to have blossoming language skills. So sign your kids up. I will absolutely make their language skills go through the roof. You start off with a group of 6-month-olds. You get the average number of words that the kids in your program know, and it's 0. None of your kids have a single word. You have a 1.5-year program. Kids are 2, or let's say you have a 2.5-year program. Kids are 3 when they finish the program. When the kids graduate from your program, many of them have 200, 300, 500 word vocabularies. You say, send kids to my language development program. They enter knowing no words and they leave knowing up to 500 words. Pay me a lot of money and I'll make your child a genius. Well, any sort of knowledgeable parent will appreciate that if you don't send your kid to this program, they will still grow a vocabulary from about 0 at 6 months to a vocabulary of somewhere around probably 200 to 500 by their 3rd birthday. Your treatment may have nothing to do with it. It's simple, natural development. Another common form of maturation is fatigue. People get tired, and I saw this a lot when I worked with people who were doing neuropsychological testing. People would come in for a neuropsych test, and they would start at 8 o'clock in the morning, and they would test until 4 or 5 in the afternoon. I would do the same. I worked in a clinic where I tested kids, and the most common question is, does this kid have ADHD? People would come in from hundreds of miles away. They'd want all the testing done in one day. You start testing the kid at 8, and you'd finish testing at 1 or 2 or 3 in the afternoon. Well, if an ADHD 6-year-old boy or a head-injured 20-year-old or post-stroke 70-year-old is doing more poorly on the test they take at 4 in the afternoon than the test they were taking at 8 in the morning, is it because they do more poorly in these subjects? Or is it because they're exhausted? They are absolutely, their brain is just fried right now, and they need to start over fresh. That's a maturation effect. If you say, well, because they did the math test in the morning and they did great, and the reading test in the afternoon they did terribly, their reading skills are just horrible. But it's really that they were just exhausted. Then it really isn't that tests are different. It really is just a maturation effect. Okay, so now we've had history and maturation. One of the best ways to take care of maturation, similar to history, is control group. And again, we will come back to that because it works for very many of these. Instrumentation has to do with the idea that sometimes our instruments don't work very well. And if we have an instrument that's not working very well, it may be that we think that people are changing, and it's actually just the instrument is changing. So again, if you watch the lecture on test reliability, if you have a measure that is unreliable and it changes, then it may not be that the phenomenon has changed. It may simply be an unreliable measure. So let's say we have people who are joining a weight loss program, and they come into the program and they weigh in, and the average person in the program weighs 200 pounds. Now, they participate in this program for several months. They come back, and on average, everybody has lost about 20 or 30 pounds. Pretty much to a person, they get on the scale, and everyone is at least 20 pounds lighter. And you say, cool, this must be a pretty effective program. At the same time, as everybody gets on the scale, they say, you know, I know that this says that I weigh 25 pounds or 22 pounds or 20 pounds or something less than what I did before I started, but my clothes don't fit any looser. I don't look any different. I don't feel any different. I have a hard time believing that I've lost 20 pounds. Well, did people not lose weight? One of the things you can do is, if you're using a scale, a physical instrument, you want to make sure your instrument is working. So, if you're using a scale, it would be good to have a brick. You've got a 20-pound cinder block, and you take the brick and you put it on the scale at the beginning of your study, and it says, well, let's say you got a 50-pound cinder block. It weighs 50 pounds. You put it back on your desk or on the floor. If at the end of the study you put your cinder block that weighed 50 at the beginning of the study on the scale, and the cinder block weighs 30 pounds, oh my goodness, the weight loss program was so effective. Even the cinder block lost 20 pounds. Maybe your scale broke. So instrumentation is when it looks like a change is happening, but maybe it's not really happening. Maybe your instruments just aren't working. And one of the best things to do here is test your instruments and make sure that they are working. So put that brick on the scale every week instead of just at the end of the study. Test sensitivity is sort of the parallel to instrumentation, only this is if you're using psychological measures as compared to physical measures. So test sensitivity is that if I'm giving people tests, and it has a slightly different thing too. If I give people the same test time after time, it has a slightly different meaning. So that if we take the logical extreme example, I give you an IQ test today. I'm doing a program to try to make you smarter. You take an IQ test today. You leave and you come back next week. I give you the IQ test again next week. You leave and you come back and I give you the IQ test. Every day or every week after we've had our treatment intervention, you get an IQ test again. Well, what do you think is going to happen to people's IQ scores? The first week I scored 115. The second week I scored 122. The third week I scored 140. The fifth week I scored 170. I'm turning this whole classroom into geniuses. Or maybe people are just learning the questions and they're getting speedier and they're going home and they're looking up the things they don't know. And they're not getting any smarter, they're just getting smarter about how to take the test. So with instrumentation, you want to make sure your instruments are working. With tests, you want to try to reduce the fact that if I take a Beck depression inventory every week, I might, how did I answer it last week? And do I want to look like I'm doing better? And how did I answer that question? I think I'm feeling better. I think I need to change my answer, but what did I put down last week? So you want to have this such that people don't take tests so often that all they're doing is remembering how they did. Or you want to have it where some tests have form A, form B, or some even have form A, B, C, and D, and you give different forms of the test, which are all correlated at a very high degree so that the alternate forms really do all measure the same thing. Selection bias has to do with the idea of who gets into the study, influences the outcome of the study. And here, in my clinical experience, where I have seen the biggest concern of this, as any of you who are familiar with Marshall Linehan's work on dialectical behavioral therapy for people with borderline personality, or DBT for BPD, for all of us who love living in a world of acronyms. In Linehan's study, which shows really very, very nice outcomes of DBT for BPD, she has a requirement that in order to be a participant, you must attend, I think it's at least 50 of 52 weekly sessions. Now, my experience clinically, and the experience of almost anyone I know, colleagues, friends, students, and so forth, is that it is very hard for a client to attend 50 out of 52 therapy sessions. And the clients who are able to do that are probably among the healthiest clients that we have because A, they can organize their life well, B, they have cars that actually get them places instead of not having a car or having the car break down. C, there's not so many crises in their life or the lives of their friends, or, they didn't decide to sleep through it because they were drinking last night, or all of the myriad of things that get in the way of people's ability to make it into therapy. So if we say Linehan's people are doing way better, well, maybe it's who makes it into Linehan's study, because I have yet to meet a therapist who works with people with borderline personality who think that their clients could show up for 50 of 52 sessions or 48 of 52 sessions. So sometimes who makes it into a study may have more to do with what we make of the outcome. And I'm not saying that that's true of Linehan's work, but it may be that people self-select in. Another example I like to use is you're doing, offering a treatment program for organizational skills. And so you get a group, you run an ad, and you have 50 people who say, I really want to take this program on improving my organizational skills. So you have people come in, and you decide that what you're going to do is the treatment group is going to fill up first. And when you have 25 people in treatment group, then you're going to fill up your waiting list control group. So the first 25 people who walk through the door go into the treatment program. The last 25 people who walk through the door go in the control program. You run your How to Become Organized / Time Management group, and you find at the end that the people in the treatment program are so much more organized and so much better with their time than the people in the control group. And you say, my treatment was very successful. Well, maybe it was the fact that the people who are sufficiently organized to get there as the first 25 rather than as the last 25 who lost their forms, who couldn't figure out where to park their car, who they forgot to look up the directions, and they had to get a telephone book, and they had to use their cell phone. And because they're disorganized, they couldn't make it there on time. And hence, your 25 most organized people look like, wow, we did much better than the control group. Who gets in can have a large influence sometimes on the conclusions we draw. So you want to make sure, if you split people into groups, that they're as equivalent as possible. And we'll come back to how one does that. The last one here is experimental mortality. There are many other forms of threats to internal validity, but if we went over them all, you would all be absolutely sound asleep. Experimental mortality has to do with not killing subjects in your study, but with people dropping out of the study prematurely. And this happens a lot in clinical work. So people start, then people finish, and then often we'll try to do like a 6-month follow-up or a 1-year follow-up or a 5-year follow-up. And many times we have attrition all the way down. And often the attrition is not just due to chance factors. So let's say you're doing an addiction study, and you start out with the first, let's say, 100 people who sign up or who finish your intensive outpatient program or your inpatient program or whatever program. But you start out with 100 people. Now, you run your program, and at the end of the program, about 80 people have stuck with it. Of these 80 people, let's say you're doing really well. Of the 80 people who graduate, fully 100% are smoke-free, drug-free, alcohol-free, whatever it is that your program was working on. You continue to collect data. So this is pre, this is post. At post, 80 people show up and 100% are clean and sober. You now get a 6 months. At the 6-month follow-up, only 40 people show up. However, fully 100% of those people are clean and sober. And at the 1-year follow-up, 25 people show up. And you know what? Fully 100% of them are clean and sober. And you say, this is wonderful. I'm going to publish that we did a treatment intervention for drug and alcohol addiction, and we started, 100 people joined the program, and we ran this program where we did a full, we did follow-ups out to the course of a year. And at the end of a year, 100% of the people who came were clean and sober. Fully 100%. Is this a great program or what? Now, you didn't lie. You didn't say 100% of the people who started the program are clean and sober. But you did mislead by saying that fully 100% are clean and sober. And you didn't say, however, 75 people never came back for follow-up. So if this is what the data says, a good, honest researcher says, oh, and by the way, 75 people aren't accounted for, and it might be that they're all clean and sober too, and it might be that every single one of them relapsed, and that's how come they didn't show up. And is it likely that they relapse? Well, certainly people who do better in programs are more likely to show up for follow-ups because A, they feel like, wow, you really helped me, and because B, they want to come and brag. People who have relapsed may feel like, oh, this program was just yet another program that I failed at, and oh, I feel too ashamed. I don't want to go and, tell them, gosh, I've been drugging, for the last 8 months, so I think I'll just stay home. So oftentimes who drops out of studies isn't just sort of random chance factors. It really has to do with systematic things, and so you need to really chronicle that for the reader. Now, what do you do to try to take care of these? Well, for experimental mortality, ideally, as I said, you chronicle the story, and you do the best you can to keep people showing up. And that's many times people will offer all sorts of incentives for people to come back. So they'll offer food, they'll offer money, they'll have drawings, for a new HD TV or whatever it is that your agency can afford. For history, maturation, instrumentation, and test sensitivity, the single best thing you can do, in addition to being aware of these, is to do a treatment group and a control group. A treatment group is the group that gets the intervention. A control group is a group of people who are as similar as possible in all respects, except they don't get the intervention or they don't get the same intervention. And sometimes you can't get a control group. Ideally, for a control group, you draw in a group of 50 people and you do some sort of random process. So for selection bias, you want to make sure, if you have people in a treatment and control group, that the two groups are as equal as possible. So how do you do that? You draw your sample of 50 or your sample of 100 or your sample of however many. You bring all of their names in, and then you draw straws. You have people, pick numbers out of a hat, number 1, number 2. You plug through every other one. You do a table of random numbers. You do something which helps equalize the groups as best as possible. And sometimes people will even do a pretest. You can also do a thing called matching, and matching is if you know there's a variable that may be related to your outcome. If you think that gender might make a difference. The first man who comes in, you put in group A. Second man, you put in group B. First woman, you put in group A. Second woman, you put in group B, and so forth. So you can equalize on 1 or 2 variables. So if you have your control group, and the control group is you start with a group of people and then you select which groups they're in based on as much sort of biasing things as possible. There's also a comparison group. A comparison group is if you can't put people in groups, you just need to find a group that you can compare them to. I'm doing this treatment intervention in this school, so I have to find a school which is similar. I'm doing a new program in Walla Walla. I have to find another community that's sort of like Walla Walla. So that's a comparison group. With history, maturation, instrumentation, and test sensitivity, if we have our New York City group of people who are doing our stress intervention and 9/11 happens, if 9/11 impacts the people who are in my anxiety treatment group, it will also impact a control group, probably equally well. And then if the control group gets even more anxious than the people in my group, we can say, well, at least there was some beneficial effect. With maturation, if the kids in my learning language group go from 0 words to 500 words, and another group of 6-month-olds who age to age 3 over the course of treatment also develop vocabularies of 500 words, don't pay for my program. But if they have an average vocabulary of 100 words, and the kids in my group have an average vocabulary of 500, my group might still be worth something. But without the control group, you wouldn't know. Are you simply measuring development, or are you measuring something meaningful? Instrumentation, even if my scale breaks, if I have a control group, the control group that didn't get my weight loss program, they all lost 20 pounds. The people who did do my weight loss program, they all lost 20 pounds. everyone lost 20 pounds, but my treatment program was no more helpful than was not coming to treatment, so why bother do it? And test sensitivity is the same thing. The sensitivity of a test should not vary by whether you're treatment or control or treatment or comparison. So the single best way to take care of a lot of threats to internal validity is to have a control or at least a comparison group. Anyway, that is enough brilliant scientific knowledge to fill your brain for a while, and this is the end of this which should probably be about number 3 in your series.